in the spirit, fullest control. Confident living rights every wrong.
I'm Mike Costello, and I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about the garden of your mind. So often it's easier for us to relate to spiritual and mental issues if we can have some comparison to them on the physical plane of existence that we understand and realize so well. When I was a little boy, we had a garden in our backyard and a trellis, and on that trellis was a beautiful climbing rose bush. For at least 10 or 15 years of my childhood, I can remember the radiant beauty of these yellow roses that would come out every spring and summer and last into the fall and would bring us such great and magnificent beauty. The trellis was an ordinary one. It was wood and painted white, and the branches of that rose bush went through it. And each year, as the branches would come to blossom again, because either my grandfather or the gardener would have cut it back in the winter before, we would begin to see green, and out of the green we would begin to see blossoms, and then that vine would fill that entire trellis. And that hardy rose bush was a magnificent story of the perennial reality of the garden. It was a perennial. It came back every year. It came back year after year, bringing beauty. And in the periods of beauty and between the periods of beauty, there were times in which it was cut back, it was pruned, it died, and it appeared to be totally dead at some points in time. I remember just after Thanksgiving, when they would prune it back, it looked like it was just killed because there was no life in it. And then during the months of November and December and into January, there was nothing. And then out of it came something magnificent and beautiful. Our minds, our mental and spiritual gardens need to have that kind of perennial power, that kind of perennial strength that allows us to bring forth beauty and solutions to problems and guidance and direction, and to give us the dimension of life that that rose gave to our family and to our friends and to everyone who came into the yard. We have a mental and spiritual garden within us, and that garden within our mind and within our soul needs the same kind of care and the same kind of love and the same kind of devotion that that perennial rose had in the rose garden of my old family home when I was growing up. You know, when you plant a bush or that rose bush, it was necessary for it to have roots that went down into the soil. And the soil needed to be cultivated, it needed to be treated, and it needed to be fed. And so it was a combination of things that were done to the soil and to the plant that allowed it to have its perennial blossoming and its strength. And each time it came back more magnificent and more beautiful than it had been before. Sometimes in our minds, we need to look to the cultivation of the physical gardener and embrace the reality that the master gardener, the divine intelligence that guides the universe, that resides in your heart and in your mind and in mine and in our hearts, is cultivating and tilling the soil and preparing it just as the soil of that garden is prepared by the physical gardener. Soil has to be pliable and it has to be fed. If you put a rose in concrete, the rose bush would have its roots into the wet concrete, and the concrete would dry. It wouldn't feed that rose, and the rose would wither and die. Sometimes our minds are a little bit like concrete. Our minds tend not to be as pliable as they should be, not to be as supple, not to be as invigorated and as changing as the physical soil. But we need to change and turn the soil of our minds in order to allow ourselves to have the garden of mental and spiritual health that we really want to have. The other thing that happens in the care and treatment of rose bushes and gardens is the pulling out of weeds. Weeds allow or keep the roots from growing. They suffocate the plant. In our minds, what we have that are similar to weeds is negative thought. And it is the negative thoughts that need to be weeded out or pulled out of the dynamic of our mind. The other kind of negative thoughts that we need to weed and pull out of our mind may be hurt feelings, something that's happened in the past, guilts that we have, bitterness. Hate is one of the most destructive weeds of our consciousness and our awareness. And it is consciousness that we need to cultivate, and we need to continually till and tend to in order to create the garden of our mind that we would like to have. If we weed out the negativity, and if we keep the mind pliable and not rigid like concrete, but with soil and moisture, one of the other things that we need to do is to create water in a garden. And in the garden, the water that comes either from the hose or from rain brings nourishment. It brings the strength that we need to have. And so often in our inner life, in our mind and in our heart, what we need to do in the garden within is to embrace the watering concept through the process that we call prayer. Prayer, meditation, and visualization. And so if we would cultivate our minds the way the garden is cultivated, we need to know that consciousness, like the soil, has pliable nutrients. We need to know that we have water, which is prayer and meditation. We need to pull out the weeds of negativity, of hurt and guilt. And if we begin to do that, then the garden of our mind is a beautiful place, just like the garden of my childhood was. But that garden of my childhood went through cycles. It went through the seasons of the year. And in each season, there was something that was needed that was unique to that season. In the winter time, there needed to be the pruning. It was the dark and dormant period. As the plant came to life after the pruning, it needed to have fertilizer, it needed to have water. It moved into the time of the spring, where there was happiness and light and joy. It moved from there into the summer of its period or cycle. And in the summer, there was difficulty of heat, and there were periods when it was withered. And then the cycle moved into fall, when the bush itself was spent and needed to be at a time of rest again. Our lives are like that. Our lives go through cycles. Sometimes you may be in a summer experience. You may feel like you're just worn to a frazzle and that you're just burned out. In the springtime, there may be experiences of your life and in my life and all of our lives that are likened unto the spring, when there is happiness and joy, when there's new growth, and there are dormant periods. We live in our minds and not in the world. That is a fundamental teaching of our organization and of our movement, the New Thought Christian movement. We live in our minds, and if we live in our minds, and we certainly believe that we do, we need to cultivate them, we need to tend to them, and we need to direct them so that the growth that we see is able to bring forth magnificence and beauty. Our minds are magnificent tools, tremendous gifts from God. But we need to be aware of the fact that there is a conscious mind and there is a subconscious mind. And those two dynamics are infinitely important, because the subconscious mind is like a sponge. It simply collects whatever our conscious mind sees. Whatever you see, whatever you experience, whatever you read is at issue in your conscious mind, and the subconscious mind catalogs all of that information. And when the conscious mind needs a point of reference, the subconscious provides it with that point of reference. An example would be, all of us have a thought about dentists. We see dentists as people who, in many cases, are not people that we like to go and see. And most of us don't like to go and see dentists because we have in our mind an experience, either directly, something that we've experienced, or something that someone has told us about that is negative. And therefore, when we think of the dentist, a negative thought comes into our conscious mind from the subconscious mind. Those two dynamics are infinitely important, because the subconscious mind and the way that it behaves determines how our conscious mind is going to create our thought process to deal with the challenges, the circumstances, and the situations of life. We believe in the use of affirmations and denials. The use of affirmations and denials are for the sole and single purpose of conditioning the dynamic of mind action. An affirmation may be as simple a statement as, I am at peace. I am a child of God. I am whole. A denial is a statement that tells us that the conditions that we see in life don't have control over us, and that we deny the power of those experiences. An example is, I am a child of God, therefore I do not inherit sickness. That simply means that we affirm that we are a child of God, that is an affirmative statement, and therefore I do not inherit sickness. So that says that on my inner person as a spiritual being, I do not inherit sickness. If my body is sick, my spiritual being is whole and well. And if my spiritual being is whole and well, it can have an impact on how I deal with what happens in my physical body. If my physical body is sick, and I affirm that I'm a child of God, and that as a child of God I do not inherit sickness, then I know from a conscious and subconscious standpoint that even though I am in the experience in the physical of sickness or illness, inside that illness cannot and will not touch me. The same is true with prosperity. If we affirm that the universe provides for us abundantly, then we claim the reality that abundance is our divine right, and that abundance comes to us and is directed into our life through the process of mind. The conditioning of your mind and the way that your mind acts and reacts to the circumstances and situations of life is directly related to the way that you have cultivated it. If the garden of your mind is centered in the reality of who and what you are constantly weeding out the negative thoughts. You are constantly releasing the hurts of the past. You are constantly overcoming and releasing and letting go of the guilt that you have in your life. You are eliminating and have eradicated from your consciousness and from your awareness all of the hate and the negative influences of life. You are a person who claims the reality of God's presence and participates in the process of centering yourself in that divine presence through prayer, meditation, and visualization. Your garden and my garden are of our own making, and it is within us to be able to create a perennial rose of beauty inside ourselves so that that which is outside can become beautiful, even though it sometimes appears to be ugly or not the way that we would like our world to be pictured. We picture our mind, our life, and we out-picture it in the experiences that we have. The dynamic of mind science is tremendously important in your spiritual understanding and in the creation of your own mental garden. By changing these thoughts, you can change the quality of your life. That is fundamental to the message that we bring to you. We believe in prayer and meditation as a centering force in our lives, and so we'd like to pause at this point in the program for a moment of reflection and invite you to join with us in a prayer. Eternal God, we come together as your children, remembering the beauty of the garden, the roses and the trees and the flowers, and we go within to claim that same beauty within our heart and within our mind. We dedicate ourselves to cultivating the garden of our soul, our spirit, and our mind in the same way that we would cultivate a beautiful rose in the outer garden. And we fertilize it with love and light. We weed out the negative influences of life. We release guilt and hurt and bitterness, and we claim perfect peace. We do this in the name of faith, in the name of hope, in the name of love. Amen.
That's a beautiful analogy, Michael, of using the garden as our life. And it couldn't be more apt, and it was so very inspiring. Thank you for that special talk.
Well, gardens are beautiful places, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're filled with weeds and with trees that aren't tended, and sometimes someone comes along, a gardener, and is able to tend the garden and make it a beautiful place, and other gardeners are able to maintain it as a beautiful place. And I think the same is true of our inner being. We need to have, some of us have gardens that need a lot of attention, and we have the ability through the connectiveness that we have with the master gardener, with the presence of God, to begin to pull up those weeds and water those plants and prune those roses and make the garden of our soul a beautiful place, or it can be a withered and ugly place.
Yes. Well, and to treat our own life as we would a most prized flower or vegetable or whatever it is we're growing in that wonderful garden, and to know that we're not just a physical body, but mind, body, and spirit. And you touched on the mind and the body and the spirit as you spoke. And as we align all of those and weed out the unnecessary, weed out the dross in all aspects of being, then we are truly whole and healthy, happy, aligned sons of God or daughters of God.
Yeah, that mind, body, spirit coordination or connection is just infinitely important, isn't it? In our
Yes.
personal lives, in our outer lives, and in our spiritual inner lives.
Yes. For the mind, the things we read, the music we listen to, the extracurricular activities we indulge in, whatever they may be, reading or exercise or whatever, if we do that with a high consciousness, then it pays higher dividends. And if we indulge in things that are not good for us and are detrimental to our health or our thinking mind, then we have the weeds growing, and then we have to spend more time pulling those out. And then for our body, the food we put into our body and the exercise we give it. But it's the attitude of our mind, the attitude with which we eat, I think has more to do with the food we eat than the food we put into our body, actually. Because if we have the scientists have shown us that if we have a healthy frame of mind, our body uses the food far more abundantly than if we don't.
That mind-body connection is something that more and more people are aware of, and of course medical science has known it for a long time and has acknowledged it, although they haven't been a very good leader in changing issues of mind-body and acknowledging issues of mind-body, but we know that certain diseases are created by mind, ulcers, high blood pressure, and a myriad of others, maybe cancer,
Yes.
certainly heart disease,
Yes.
that the way that we think has created for us the physical situation, but also the way we think about the food we eat, the way we think about the time that we spend, the way that our mind responds to the experiences of life connects to that physical being. And I think food is a good topic to discuss because today so many people have ideas about this being bad or that being bad or something else. But in reality, if we're led to consume what we feel and are directed is a good and wholesome diet. And if our mentality is as it should be as we assimilate that food, then our needs will be met.
That's right. And we can see older people who have lived long, long years. For example, my dad lived 90 wonderfully healthy, strong years. And he ate whatever he chose, and there was lots of fat and lots of sugar in his diet. He never gained extra weight because he didn't overeat, but he ate what he chose. And I can remember my mother laughing about that he would eat a whole pie, for example. And those were relatively small pies, but still that was a lot of dessert for one person. But he worked hard, he used his body physically, and then he could eat whatever he chose. And again, I think it was his frame of mind. His thinking kept him slender. And so it is. It's as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he.
So is he. And it's absolutely true. And I think we have some good advice from a nutritional standpoint. And certainly some of it has been valid and some of it has been very much in question. You know, one time we hear that oat bran is the source of all life, and then we hear that it's not. And we hear that the elimination of butter and the consumption of margarine solves our problem. And then a little while later we hear that the margarine is worse than the butter. But we're not nutritionists here. But from a religious and spiritual standpoint, we have to realize and accept the fact that the creative power of mind has the ability to influence us. And so we need to be cautious because if we begin to tell people that something is bad that is not necessarily bad, then the mind is a creative force and it sets into motion that which is created in the outer.
Exactly. So you're right, we need to guard against that, and doctors do help in the helping professions, they all need to do that. And also with our children and as we teach others, to teach in a positive way, which you do so beautifully, as opposed to teaching in a negative way, a negative aspect of being. And it makes life far more beautiful and more rewarding. And the proof that love and what we give out is shown in so many different ways. There's been blind studies made of food that's been blessed and food that's not been blessed, and then it having been consumed. And the people could tell, the contestants could tell exactly which food had been blessed and which hadn't. And there's, if people need proof, which we know we don't need proof because we see it as living proof. But if you need proof, it's been proven. And it's just like babies in hospitals and orphanages. If they're held for a certain amount of time a day, they do ever so much better than if they've not been held and loved. And this energy of love going out to them makes a difference in the way they grow.
This energy of love is creative. It's just like, and beauty is creative
Yeah.
and creates after its own kind. Moving away from the nutritional aspect, just in the thought process, if we think about something being real, such as in our day, so many people are confused and concerned about violence.
Right.
And so we begin the process, if perhaps in a neighborhood there's a break-in, so then people begin to build upon the consciousness of the fact that this house has been broken into, there's violence in our neighborhood, our environment has been violated, and this negative influence creates a vibration that calls into that area greater and greater violence. And so perhaps there's another break-in and another break-in where what we're called to do is to change our way of thinking. And if that happens, if violence comes into our neighborhood, into our family, into our community, into our world, then we're called to enfold it in love, pull the weeds of negativity out, to bless it, much like that food,
Yes.
and to call the presence of peace into those areas. And that process on an individual level will begin to deal with the violence that we have in life.
Yes. Yes. And if it's, I just hope everyone who hears us speaking will take time each day to attune to the divine within, to God the whole, and know the light in stillness. Know that life is good and all is well. And if we do that, it makes a difference in our environment. And I know a home where people who enter that home say it's so peaceful, it's so serene, and indeed it is, because that's what the owner lives, serenity and peace. And if we can each do that, then it makes a difference in the world.
It makes a difference in the world that begins with each one of us individually.
Yes.
And so often we want to change the world, and we want the world to be different, but we know that we can only do it in us, and we can do it one person at a time. And I think that the way to attack the issue of violence in our society today is to begin one person at a time, one family, one group at a time, one church at a time, one club at a time, and begin the process of enfolding the violent and the inharmonious areas in the presence of God, bringing peace and the vibration of peace to those areas. And then the process begins, and it begins with us. It begins with our own ability to claim peace for ourselves and others. As Dr. Garlish and Hattie Garlish, who was the foundress of our congregation, said so often, the newspaper is the most wonderful prayer journal that you can get. What if everyone in the world got the newspaper every morning, and instead of reading it and saying, isn't it awful, and isn't it terrible, and I'm afraid and I'm going to put bars on my windows, instead went through and systematically enfolded each of these areas of conflict and violence and pain and suffering and death in the love and light of God. If everybody began to do that, the consciousness of the planet would shift, the consciousness of the community would shift, and we would have a beautiful garden of life.
Yes. And it all begins with the gardener. Each person who does that would feel the peace and contentment within himself or herself more fully as that energy goes out to envelop the world.
And that's exactly what happened from a scriptural standpoint in the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
It wasn't that God wanted to cast Adam and Eve out at all. It was that their consciousness changed. They became aware of certain things. And so as they changed their way of thinking, and it was really an admonition to all of us, as we change our way of thinking, we separate ourselves from God, and we move out of the Garden of Eden. And we're able to move back into Eden anytime we claim the center of peace that we really have a right to.
And we can tell within our own bodies when we're living the life and when we're not, because we feel centered, we feel our chakras, we have the 7 force centers in our body, and the solar plexus chakra is the center of the emotional body. And so we know by our solar plexus chakra, that's our guide, That's our clock. It tells us what we're doing and what we're not doing right. So as if it's calm and peaceful, then we know that we're leading a calm and peaceful life. And we're sending those energies out into the world, and we're doing our part. That way, we're pulling up the weeds or not allowing the weeds to grow in the first place without artificial chemicals. We're just doing it the natural way.
And that's so needed in today's environment because I think people feel so out of control. They feel that situations are so helpless in terms of violence.
Yeah.
And I think people need to understand that they have the ability to do something dynamic and wonderful.
Yes. Be still and know that I am God, and do whatever we can at the moment at hand, wherever it is, to keep the weeds from growing and to pull the weeds up that have grown.
And beyond that, to go looking for gardens that need tending. And of course, that's what we
Very
do
good.
in our church center and in our
Yes.
classes and in this program.
Yes.
We're talking to people about taking gardens that are unkept and that are
Right.
full of weeds and beginning the process of making them a beautiful place.
Taking charge of your own garden of life and make it a spot of beauty. Oh, that's a lovely thought.
And then sharing that with others, and then becoming a master gardener together with God in showing people and empowering people to pull up those weeds. And the weeds of hate and suffering and pain and resentment and the negative issues of the past need to be pulled out of our lives.
Otherwise, it affects our physical body, and it affects our way of thinking, and it affects the quality of our life more than we care to have happen.
Immensely. So in the garden of our life, in our minds and our bodies and our spirits, we want to have places of beauty and tranquility. And Reverend Freelander and I have been sharing these concepts of gardening your life and pulling the negative aspects and weeds out so that you can blossom and flower. And we hope that you've enjoyed this discussion, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Confident living rights every wrong. Dynamic power helps me be strong. Confident living comforts my heart. From such a blessing I can't depart. Confident living helps me expand visions of value, the kingdom at hand. Confident living, talent to win, gift of the Spirit lives from within.